Hello world, thought I'd come to you today with another song on the story. Well, it's not quite a song on a story, it's songs in a story really. I want to look at Saturday Night Fever, in particular the relationship between the songs, as in the soundtrack, and the actual plot of the movie itself. I want to explore a little bit about how this is a film of multiple deceptions which somehow all pull against one another, and yet somehow at the end of the day manage to pull together by the end, and we do actually get quite a hopeful message at the end of this film. So, Saturday Night Fever was shot in 1977. It was shown first in the UK in cinemas in March 1978. I think that might be a couple of months after it was shown in the US, but I'm not dead certain. So it's a film starring John Travolta, who plays an Italian New Yorker called Tony Manero. His co-star is Karen Lynn Gorney, who plays Stephanie Manjaro. It's directed by a guy called John Badham, and it's produced by Robert Stigwood and Kevin McCormick. The writers are Nick Cohn, who was a British journalist, actually, and that does fit in with the story that I'm going to tell, and a guy called Norman Wexler, who would be your scriptwriter, essentially. John Travolta was basically Paramount's latest young darling. They had the intention of lifting him off the small TV screen, cute, girly, teen idol, welcome back Cotter, into being this mature adult actor, essentially showing, his versatility. He trained for 5 months in dancing. He was already physically fit, but he did a huge amount of work on his dancing for 5 solid months before he even got onto the rehearsal sets for the film. He was then also contracted to film Grease the following year, which was going to be the same but different, a musical this time. Although music plays a very large part in Saturday Night Fever, Saturday Night Fever is not a musical. Grease is definitely a musical. The songs tell as much of the story and are as much about the characters as the script does itself, which is completely different from Saturday Night Fever, where the songs are just like the icing on the cake, as it were. It soon became evident, within about 2 days worth of filming, that there was absolutely no way that the cameramen could point their cameras anywhere in Bay Ridge, which was the area of New York that they were filming in. It's sort of Queens, Brooklyn area, without there being fans all over the place. And it was basically spoiling the filming. They had a very low budget for this film, but suddenly that budget had to be increased to account for a whole lot more security. In the DVD extras, they tell stories about being in limos and caravans and just being shaken around by fans that just wanted to try and get inside the caravan. They had to go shopping for John Travolta's clothes. I wanted a load of those clothes that he wore. My God, they were brilliant clothes. Never had a John Travolta shirt or anything. But yeah, they had to go clothes shopping for him. And the shop was mobbed. They had to escape out of the back or something or other. It was very, very difficult for them to film. But they did, they managed it. And as I say, it was all filmed on location. John Travolta was also dealing with the death of one of his co-stars on The Boy in the Plastic Bubble, a lady called Diane Hyland. She was 41, she died of breast cancer, and he had actually begun a romantic relationship with her. He was half her age. So it must have been quite difficult. I mean, he would have been about 20, 21, something like that. And it must have been very difficult for him, and also to then go on to film and keep working at the same time as trying to process that grief. And there is quite a touching scene towards the end of Saturday Night Fever where we have a bench and Stephanie and Tony are sitting looking out to this bridge. I think that some of the physical affection that is in that scene is genuine. I think she is genuinely there, you know, they're filming, they're acting, but there's also a bit of not acting. She's also consoling him a little bit as well, I think. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the social context that Saturday Night Fever was filmed in. This chap, this British journalist, Nick Cohn, wrote a piece for the New York Magazine, and it was called The Tribal Rites of the New Saturday Night. It was essentially an account of the types of gangs and rituals that went on a Saturday night. He cites the fact that the 70s were quite an economic downturny period, because you've got the oil crisis, which hit America very badly during the early to mid 1970s, as opposed to the 60s, where he says that it appears like there was money for everything, for clothes, for records, for, you know, going out and whatever, and that what you had was a lot of pent up aggression and frustration being saved up for the Saturday night. I will read you some extracts of this. Now, he prefaced his article by saying that it was true. What he wrote had either been witnessed by himself or had been told to him by people who were there at the time. He had changed names to protect the innocent, and then he'd written this piece. I would add that as well as the economic downturn in the 1970s, American kids had just witnessed the best part of 2 decades worth of being drafted up to go to Vietnam. The kids that were on the scene in the late 70s, though, would have been born perhaps 1958, 59. They would have gone through the whole of the 60s without the call-up. And so essentially, by 75, 76, 77, you had a whole load of kids, not many jobs for them. You would have had a whole load of kids, as in this story by Nick Cohn. He quotes one of Vincent, who is Tony's namesake, as it were. They changed Vincent's name to Tony. In the article, we are told that one of his kids had died, one of his brothers had died in Vietnam. And that would have been every family. So, as well as this downturn, you had a whole lot of very angry teenagers here who'd lost brothers and uncles and fathers even to this Vietnam thing. And yes, they were angry about it. Very disillusioned with authority. And to cap it all, we had the ubiquitous in the 1970s values that from our point of view would seem very misogynistic, would seem racist, would seem homophobic. And all of that, the homophobia, racism, misogyny, the anger, is all shown in this film, Saturday Night Fever. And it all comes out in this article. Just going to read you some snippets of Nick Cohn's article, The Tribal Rites of the New Saturday Night. The cause of this reversion is not hard to spot. The 60s, unlike previous decades, seemed full of teenage money. No recession, no sense of danger. I would disagree with that. The young could run free. I would disagree with that. They couldn't. They were getting called up to Vietnam. Indulge themselves in whatever treats they wished. But now there is shortage once more, just as there was in the 50s. Attrition, continual pressure. So the new generation takes few risks. It goes through high school, obedient, graduates, looks for a job, saves and plans, endures. And once a week on Saturday night, it's one great moment of release. It explodes. It was the guts of winter, bitter cold. But he would not protect himself. Not on Saturday night. Not on display at Odyssey. That's the club, the dance club that's in the film. It's called the 2001 Odyssey. When he kissed his mother goodbye and came down onto 4th, strutting loose, he wore an open-necked shirt, ablaze with reds and golds, and he moved through the night with shoulders hunched tight, his neck rammed deep between his shoulder blades. Sorry, I'm making him look like he comes from Dudley. In the manner of a miniature bull. A bull in Gucci-style loafers, complete with gilded buckle and high black pants, tight as sausage skins, shuffling, gliding, stepping out. On the corner, outside Najmi Bro's grocery, he passed a Puerto Rican, some dude in a floppy velour hat, and the dude laughed out loud. So Vincent stopped still, and he glared, a gaze like a harpoon, right between the eyes. Later, he said. Moving on a bit. And for the moment, riding out toward 2001 Odyssey, they existed only as faces. Faces. According to Vincent, that's Tony Manero himself, they were simply the elite. All over Brooklyn, Queens and the Bronx, even as far away as New Jersey, spread clear across America, there were millions and millions of kids who were nothing special. Just kids. Zombies. Professional dummies going through the motions, following like sheep. School, jobs, routines. A vast faceless blob. And then there were the faces, the Vincents and the Eugenes and the Joeys. A tiny minority, maybe 2 in every 100, who knew how to dress and how to move, how to float, how to fly, sharpness, grace, a certain distinction in every gesture, and some strange instinct for rightness, beyond words, deep down in their blood. The way I feel, Vincent said, it's like we have been chosen. Odyssey was their home, their haven. It was the place, the only disco in all Bay Ridge that truly counted. Months ago there had been Revelation. 6 weeks, maybe 2 months on, there would be somewhere else. Right now, there was only Odyssey. It was a true sanctuary. Once inside, the faces were unreachable. Nothing could molest them. They were no longer the oppressed, wretched teen menials who must take orders toe the line. Here they took command. They reigned. The basic commandments were simple. To qualify as an Odyssey face, an aspirant need only be Italian between the ages of 18 and 21, with a minimum stock of 6 floral shirts, 4 pairs of tight trousers, 2 pairs of Gucci-style loafers, 2 pairs of platforms, either a pendant or a ring, and 1 item in gold. In addition, he must know how to dance, how to drive, how to handle himself in a fight. He must have respect, even reverence for facehood, and contempt for everything else. He must also be fluent in obscenity, offhand in sex. Most important of all, he must play tough. There was no overlapping. Italians were Italian, Latins were greaseballs, Jews were different, blacks were born to lose. Each had its own ideal, its own style of face, but they never touched. If one member ventured beyond his own allotted territory, he was beaten up, and that was the law. There was no alternative. Then there were girls. But they were not faces, not truly. Sometimes, if a girl got lucky, a face might choose her from the crowd and raise her to be his steady, whom he might one day even marry. But that was rare. In general, the female function was simply to be available, to decorate the doorways and booths, to fill up the dance floor, to speak when spoken to, put out as required, and then go away. In short, to obey and not to fuss. So I've given you a flavour, really, of the kind of dystopian idea that Cohn was trying to convey. I doubt whether or not, when he wrote that article, that he ever thought that it would be picked up and used as the basis for Saturday Night Fever, but he was approached, he was cut in on a deal, whatever, and they adapted it for film. Vincent, as we know, became Tony Manero. There is, in the original Nick Cohn article, an account of child sexual abuse, which in the article is avenged by the Faces. They couldn't get away with that and try and keep this suitable for young people and film censors, more of which later, for the film. So they changed that to one of the Faces getting beaten up and the rest of the gang going and avenging the Barracudas, who are a rival gang. There's no repercussions for that, by the way. There's no repercussions for an awful lot that happens in this film. But by and large, Paramount made a documentary that was at the same time true as fiction. So they had this commitment and respect and this will to tell the truth, as the tribal rights of the new Saturday Night told the truth. So it was filmed on location, as I've said. You can actually walk round Bay Ridge now. It's all changed, but it's all the same. I talked about how there was a multitude of deceptions going on in this story, and I just want to put in a killer for you here, and that is that iconic scene during Staying Alive, right at the beginning of the film, where Tony Manero, aka John Travolta, is walking down the street, and most of the time, because of the fan issues getting in the way and stuff, they had to use a stunt double. They had to do an awful lot of filming at awful o'clock in the morning in the hope that not many fans would be around. And so that very obvious daytime scene, I don't think, for example, that it's his feet. I think that's the stunt double's feet. There's very, very little of actual John Travolta in that scene. One of the other iconic parts of the film is John Travolta getting ready. We see him in his black underpants, pulling his trousers up and his hairy chest, and oh my God, I first saw this film when I was 15. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. And and that's all described in Nick Cohn's article. The writers were sticking to this perception of truth. Even the bits about Al Pacino, for example, are lifted straight out of the article. 2001 Odyssey, the club itself was real. It was kind of drab, a wooden floor with a few glitter balls. With their budget, the filmmakers came in and designed this wonderful nightclub with those great legendary panelled lit floorboards. There were mirrors around the walls so that the lights and the glitter balls would reflect everywhere, and they really transformed the club. But then in 1996, 20 years later, Nick Cohn voluntarily admitted that the article that he had written was complete and utter bunkum. Complete rubbish. He'd made it up himself. A lot of the events he had adapted from when he was a teenager, and memories of that his mates had of growing up in the 50s in London. And transferred into New York. He obviously had explored Bay Ridge a little bit. He'd even tried to get in, but I think one of the dancers or whatever had come out and vomited on him before he could even get in. So, yeah. But I think, despite the fact that it was all made up, we could all be let down and think, you know, oh God, we've been deceived and everything, and aren't we stupid, you know, for believing everything in the film. But the point was that not that we were supposed to believe it. The point was that Paramount, the directors, the producers, the writers, or Norman Wexler, whatever his name was, he believed it. And because he believed it, he made it authentic. And that then lended its authenticity to us in the audience watching it. So the fact that it wasn't true almost didn't matter. This multitude of deceptions is about to get a little bit more complicated, because we need to now consider the Bee Gees and the soundtrack of this film. Robert Stigwood, who was the other great producer, Kevin McCormick was a producer, Robert Stigwood was a music manager. He'd had loads of successful acts throughout the 1960s, including one group called the Bee Gees, a British group who had had lots of 60s style hits, pretty middle of the road style hits, and the lights all went down in Massachusetts, and To Love Somebody, lovely songs, whatever, and they were popular. But by the early 70s, their popularity had totally waned. They were dumper bound. Their relationships between the three of them, even though they were three brothers, probably because they were three brothers, in fact, had completely gone to the dogs. But Robert Stigwood was intent on building them up again. In 1975, so 2 years before Saturday Night Fever, and a year before I think they were due to actually write something for it, they'd had this album called Main Course, which spawned Nights on Broadway as a disco favourite. I don't know whether it was a single or not, but certainly Jive Talkin' was a single, very, very popular. Hits, whatever. They then had, the following year, Children of the World, which had You Should Be Dancing on it, which featured in Saturday Night Fever. And their fortunes were beginning to rise again. So by the time that they were about to release Saturday Night Fever, the Bee Gees themselves were on the poise of mega, mega, mega stardom. I would argue that what we are talking about though here is that this is disco music, but it's not disco. Because to understand what disco really is and what it emerged out of, we have to go back to the late 60s. We have to look at the aftermath of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, which by the 70s was by no means a done deal. And we have to look at the Stonewall uprising. In certain accounts, by the way, you'll hear them talking about the Stonewall riots. They were not riots. They were riots in the way that protesters for Black Lives Matter were marching and were not marching. They were rioting and looting. They were protesting. They were not rioting and looting. So in the 70s, you know, if you watch Graham Norton's Queen of Disco on the BBC, it's all wonderful by the 70s. By the 70s, it's all been wrapped up. Yeah, gay's legal in the UK. Civil rights movement's already happened. I Have a Dream's already happened. In 1974, America outlawed the anti-sodomy laws, and it was federal law. So basically that meant that gay men were free to have sex in any way that they liked without it being the business of law enforcement or anything like that. but it was, it still was not ideal circumstances. Gay people on both sides of the Atlantic, black people on both sides of the Atlantic, were still essentially living their lives dodging bullets, trying to keep their heads down as much as they can. And this is how disco music emerged. I want to quote to you a little passage from a book called The Front Runner, written in 1974, about a gay man. Well, it's a fictional story, totally fictional. 1974 was the year, as I said, where the anti-sodomy laws were outlawed. And this is just a little bit of her main character speaking. And there was jail if you were caught in the only act of love that made sense to you. It wasn't long before I felt that bewilderment, that choking rage that the gay feels. We were hunted animals. We were huddled underground in the dark like the Christians in the catacombs, sheltering the tiny flame of our sexual faith. What just emperor would declare the edict that would let us out into the light? What harm did we do? Murderers and thieves harmed others, but we harmed no one except possibly, in our confusion and unresolved guilt, ourselves. I just felt that that was relevant, really, to put in, because this is how the disco movement evolved in the late 60s. It was underground clubs. It was a kind of entente cordiale between gay people and the black community. And they would convene on clubs in New York, just, nothing too ostentatious. And they'd just go and dance. And this disco music emerged from soul, from black soul music. Typical characteristics were 4 to the floor kick drum beat, syncopated guitars over bass that emphasised beat 1. You kind of felt beat 2 and beat 3. You'd have a little bit of a twiddle over beat 4, and then you'd be back to beat 1. Okay, so for example, a bass line like Jive Talking, for example, we'd have a bottom C, sort of boom, 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 and it would loop around like that. Very few chord changes for large chunks of the song. And then when you would get that chord change would feel like it was an absolute release from heaven. It would be accompanied by lush harmonies, gorgeous strings. The voice is an instrument. It's a very powerful instrument, but the lyrics are secondary. And songs were long. Much later in the 70s, when Gloria Gaynor released I Will Survive, she was a little bit taken aback by the fact that there were so many chunks of instrumental work in there. It's like, didn't you like my voice then? But no, that is characteristic of disco music. It can't really be said in a 3-minute song. It's long, because the point is preserving the party. The product of the music was not the song itself. The self-expression was the dancing. The product was the party. Given that disco was a mixture of interracial and gay sensibilities with an added dose of empowerment to female sexuality, the plot of Saturday Night Fever runs at odds with the true nature of disco. As I've said, there are themes of misogyny. There are 2 rape scenes. One where Tony rapes Stephanie. One where a girl called Annette, who is constantly in the film being humiliated and degraded by Tony as well as the other guys in the gang. She is set upon by two blokes in the back of a car. She is then criticised by Tony Manero, who's sitting in the front of the car, and uses the C word to her for ever doing it. And she cries. There's a great big scene on the bridge, and she's all crying and everything and saying, I didn't want it to happen. And it's a very, very tense pairing of the plot and the soundtrack. So the Bee Gees, as I say, they were disco but not. They were too white. They were too male and too heterosexual to ever be, genuine disco. That I don't mean that to sound racist, but to kind of be factual, really. It was too clever. Too many words. And even in one of the DVD extras for Saturday Night Fever for the 2007 anniversary edition, Robin Gibb is saying that it could be about 9/11. What? What were you taking on that day? Kind of thing. No, it wasn't. It was about surviving and being tough in New York, but don't kid yourself, mate. As far as the Bee Gees were concerned, disco was only an extra string to their musical bow. I talked about Main Course being their first album when they were sort of getting their mojo back again. But it only had 3 disco songs on it. The rest is all pretty much middle of the road, little bit of country there, but nothing, gritty and hard like even Jive Talking. It's a pastiche, if you like. We can turn our hand to disco if we want to. Even if we consider the soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever, we've got a couple of rehashed songs from Main Course and from Children of the World. You Should Be Dancing, for example. So we've got about 8 songs in total that were by the Bee Gees. They weren't all necessarily performed by the Bee Gees, but they were by the Bee Gees. The rest of it by a whole hodgepodge of other people. We've got Casey and the Sunshine Band, Cool and the Gang. There's a couple of very long instrumental disco pieces that probably are real disco by a guy called David Shire. Like they are sort of 6 minutes long. There's another one that's about 8 or 9 minutes long. And yeah, that's where real disco is. You could cut the words away. You don't even really need it. The excitement is what's going on the dance floor. It's not a great vehicle to express human emotions or anything like that. It is about dancing. It's the dancing that expresses the emotions. It's why when we watch John Travolta dance in Saturday Night Fever, it's why it feels so good. But, as I say, I don't even know all the words to these very well-known Bee Gees songs, even if I've played them all my life and enjoyed them all my life. I couldn't go on Pointless and have Richard Osman ask me for words of 4 or more letters from the song Staying Alive. Couldn't do it, because disco is not, it's just not about the words, and it's therefore a little bit awkward. And as I say, the Bee Gees, although they did disco, it wasn't their primary thing. And when they had the whole disco sucks thing, the Bee Gees' fortunes toppled again until round about 1982, something like that. They wrote a song called Heartbreaker for Dionne Warwick, and they wrote a song called Islands in the Stream for Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton, and both of those were more in the traditional Bee Gees mode. The film has a hopeful ending. Manero decides that his life of being a waster, being a gang member, being a brute is not really for him. He wants to get out of it. and he moves out of Bay Ridge. There's no repercussions either from the Barracuda gang scene or the rape scene, at least Tony Manero's rape scene. He goes to meet Stephanie again and apologise to her, but that's as far as it goes. There's no real repercussions, and of course the audience just wants Tony and Stephanie to get together, and they don't quite get together romantically, but no, that's a spoiler, but whatever. Okay, so I want to talk about the censorship here because it is important. In the 70s, in the United Kingdom, there were 4 classifications according to the British Board of Film Classifications, the BBFC, which still exists today and still classify films today. So we had a U, universal, suitable for all, Winnie the Pooh. We had an A, which was generally suitable for children, but might include some scenes that parents would be cautious about under 14s seeing. I think Superman, for example, was an A, and I can remember going to the cinema week in, day after day, with my cousin, with my friends and whatever, and going to see Superman without being accompanied by an adult, and I was definitely not 14. There was the double A, which was 15, and then the X, which was the equivalent of an 18. And of course, Saturday Night Fever received an X. However, hot on the heels of Saturday Night Fever was Grease, and Grease caused absolute mayhem. If the fan adulation of John Travolta had been chaotic in Saturday Night Fever, it was 1,000,000 times more for Grease. Part of that was that Grease was fair and square an A. Therefore, 14-year-olds could go and see it, and 14-year-olds went to see it. By golly, did they go to see it. The queues for the cinema would go down the street. The cinema would have, I think it would have been the Mecca Cinema that we went to in Clacton, had 3 screens, and all 3 of them would be showing Grease, and they would be showing a matinee and an evening performances, and all the time that long line for most of the summer of 1978, it just begged belief. Part of the reason for that, obviously, we didn't have videos in those days, DVDs, we couldn't stream it either, and so if we wanted to see Grease, which of course we wanted to see it over and over again, we had to go to the cinema. But that then put the cinemas under pressure, because loads of these kids that wanted to go and see Grease also wanted to see Saturday Night Fever, but they weren't old enough to. They were concerned that people were sneaking in. We didn't have ID back in those days. So, you know, maybe even just a bit of lippy on or something would make you look a little bit older. So they were concerned that people were getting in to see Saturday Night Fever and not actually understanding what it was they were going to see. Paramount just wanted 14-year-olds to go and see it because they wanted their money. I've never actually been to a cinema to see it because I was way too young. In 1977, I had my 9th birthday. The first time I saw it was on the TV, and it said A version next to it. It's an after 9 o'clock watershed thing, and it was the A version. And the story of how Saturday Night Fever got its A version is told on the BBFC website. It's really interesting, and I would encourage anyone to actually to go and follow it up, because it gives all of the reasons why the double A version, because while they were filming, they knew that they wanted to make a TV version for American TV, late night TV, for example. And so they were filming alternative scenes where perhaps the language wasn't so bad. Because as I say, I first saw it when I was about 14 as an A version. I didn't see it again until a couple of years ago. I was bored during lockdown. And I spent a fiver downloading it and watched it, and I didn't even know that the Americans knew the C word. Certainly never really heard them use it, but there it is, just coming out every other sentence, as well as all the abusive racial terms. And obviously, you can't let 14-year-olds see that. But Paramount were desperate. They were trying to, any which way, to get that film cut down and edited to be suitable for an A certificate. The same lot that had been in to see Grease. Remember, I saw Grease when I was 10. So they wanted that kind of certification for it. They did eventually get it because, as I say, they made a double A version, or what would be considered to be a double A version, a 15 version for television for America, just by cutting out the language or whatever. They presented that to the British Board of Film Classifications. They said, no, to make that an A, you would have to do this, 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 and this. And all of those documents are on the BBFC website. And then once that had been done, there's a document on there as well where it explains the plot now that it's an A version. So the rape scenes just look like the girl is refusing sex, for example. But there is so much there that is cut out. And the BBFC concluded by saying, we agreed with the original X certificate. It's appropriate. It makes the reasons why Tony Manero would choose a different course for his life abundantly clear to young adults. Whereas in the A version, you're almost wondering what the fuss was about. A lot of because they do test these things out, they do test them with 14-year-olds, for example. And they just thought that 14-year-olds aren't going to get it anyway. They're going to enjoy the dancing, the music, the Bee Gees, whatever, but they're just not going to get it. But it got an A certificate as well. So there were, for a long time, actually two versions of Saturday Night Fever. The X version, the one that the director approved himself, and then this watered down A version, which didn't really satisfy the director, John Badham. I don't think it really interested the kids. I mean, certainly I can't remember there being any fuss at all in 1979 when Saturday Night Fever was given that, or the cut down version of Saturday Night Fever was given a preview. They weren't allowed to show them at the same time, by the way. There had to be a certain gap in between so that you'd have the X version being shown. There would be no chance that a child could get in to see it thinking it was the A version. You'd have the A version. There would be no chance for somebody to accidentally pick up the wrong reels and put on an X version. So yeah, so that's really all I've got to say to you about Saturday Night Fever. It's been really fun looking into it. I have my reservations about the film, but I'm just like any 14-year-old really. I'm 14 going on 56. I just love the music, just love the atmosphere, the dancing and everything really. And I could take or leave the plot, although I do think it's interesting how that plot came about. So I hope that has been entertaining for you. If it has been, remember to give this video a like, subscribe, share if you dare. If you've really enjoyed this video and you want to support the channel, then please consider a super thanks. I've been a little bit scant on my content recently. In March, I think it's been a bit of a bare month. I do try and make at least 3 or 4 videos a month, and I've made 3 this month. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed them, and yeah, I will see you soon. Bye.